Hola, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos todos a este día especial, muy especial porque cumplimos 196 años en el Museo del Prado. Y simplemente pues, dar de nuevo la bienvenida a Elizabeth Cropper, no voy a introducirla de nuevo, y simplemente pues, que sirva unas palabras para romper el hielo y anunciar el título de su conferencia de esta tarde, que es Guido Reni en el Museo del Prado, el éxito y el fracaso del Rubens italiano de Malvasia. Gracias.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Miguel. And as I welcome you all back tonight, I would just like to begin by thanking Miguel Falomir, the Associate Director of the Prado, for all the hospitality and effort, really, the group working with him at the Kazan, at the Centro, put into this really important and interesting, I hope, series. And also for all of the new developments that are taking place in research and conservation at the Prado, which is very, very exciting to be part of. So, just to recap a little bit, last week I pointed to the way in which, following Francesco Scanelli, Carlo Cesare Malvasia singled out Guido Reni, Domenichino, Guercino, and Francesco Albani as the four pupils of the Carracci, who continued the traditions of the Carracci Academy, each contributing different strengths to the Bolognese school. He also specified, I mentioned last week, that these strengths were accompanied by certain defects, especially where the leading contenders, Guido Reni and Domenichino, were concerned. In his words, and this is Malvasia, Guido Reni was lacking in ideas and erudition, and Domenichino lacked bold resolution and facility. Accordingly, Malvasia continues, as much as Guido showed tenderness and daring, Domenichino showed circumspection and polish, end quote. And as a result, Malvasia concludes, painters in Florence and Rome, fond of finish and diligence, understandably preferred the work of Domenichino, whereas the Lombard and Bolognese schools, quote, more attuned to tenderness and audacity, gave first place to Guido. So Malvasia, naturally taking the Bolognese position, placed Guido Reni at the very head of the generation trained by the Carracci without hesitation. Guido was, after all, older than the others and had helped Francesco Albani and Domenichino study the principles of drawing, while all three were in Dennis Calvert's studio. Malvasia describes Guido as deriving his celestial ideas from heaven itself, and then making the entire world fall in love with his modern divine style. And it was thanks to Guido, Malvasia claimed, that priceless paintings were now purchased on the market, to the advantage of painters and of painting in general. Now, Malvasia's admiration for Guido was by no means unqualified, and his life of the painter is one of the most complex, even anguished, in the Felsina. As we shall see next week, ambivalence also characterizes Malvasia's life of Domenichino, Reni's rivalrous other. But whereas Malvasia had to overcome his lack of sympathy for a man he never knew, and admit a grudging respect for Domenichino, in Guido's case, he had to temper his love for the artist and his work with knowledge of his many weaknesses, especially his compulsive gambling and his refusal to work to order, even for the most powerful rulers in Europe. He never doubted, however, that Guido was destined to succeed the Carracci, and reports that from the very beginning, Guido's accomplishment made Annibale Carracci nervous. When Ludovico, says Malvasia, helped Guido to render the soft flesh of the child in his Virgin and Child with Saints Catherine and Hyacinth, Annibale is reported by Malvasia to have exclaimed, "Do not teach him so much, for God's sake, otherwise one day he'll know much more than us all. Don't you see he's never satisfied, that he always looks for new things, for some new allure, elegance, and refinement? Remember, Ludovico, One day he will make you regret it. After Guido moved to Rome 1601, he entered into an intense rivalry with Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, who, threatening to knock his head in, accused him of stealing his style in the Crucifixion of St. Peter, painted in 1604-5 for Cardinal Pietro Aldobrandini's titular church of San Paolo alle Tre Fontane. Reni was being promoted by Caravaggio's enemies, and he was a quick and skillful interpreter of Caravaggio's new and original manner. Of course, you can see very clearly the powerful chiaroscuro and naturalism in which Guido is rivaling Caravaggio. This phase of his work, this intense study of Caravaggio at least, was short-lived, but in certain ways his strengths and weaknesses were not unlike Caravaggio's. Both would be criticized for their failure to compose numbers of figures in significant action, or to istoriare in terms of Italian criticism, and both preferred to concentrate on single figures or to put figures together in simple assemblages. Yet where Caravaggio deployed figures he claimed to have taken from the street, representing the worst in nature, Guido's were thought to be more beautiful than anything to be seen in nature. Malvasia sought to explain how the spell of such a novel and charming beauty seduced so many collectors to desire his work that Guido simply couldn't keep up with the commissions he received. He was barely able, for example, to complete the Saints Peter and Paul for the Sampieri in 1605-6, even though he wanted to bedazzle the followers of Caravaggio in Rome, where he painted it, and of Ludovico Coraci in Bologna, where it was destined to go. For the moment, it will have to be enough to say that by the time the huge Pietà dei Mendicanti, one of the great treasures of the Pinacoteca Nazionale in Bologna, was installed on the high altar of the church of that name in Bologna on November the 3rd, 1616, the character of Guido's mature accomplishment was established, even if it was still evolving. And to give you just a brief summary, among other commissions, he had decorated the Annunciation Chapel in the Quirinal Palace for Pope Paul V Borghese, and he had worked for the Dominicans in Bologna. He had produced iconic works, such as the Massacre of the Innocents for his friend the Conte Berraud, and, by contrast, the fresco of Aurora for Cardinal Scipione Borghese in the garden loggia at Palazzo di Montecavallo in Rome. He had demanded and received high fees for his work, but even more than that, he had received the respect and honours appropriate to a man of rank. Guido had problematized the nature of authorship, insisting that any work he had invented and retouched was a Guido Reni. He'd even threatened to give up painting altogether and become a dealer, as a way of calling attention to the insane increases in the value of his works on the market, from which he personally did not benefit. And he had turned down repeated invitations to the courts of Spain and France. Much of Malvasia's information came from those who'd worked closely with Guido before his death on a hot August day in 1642. As a result, he reported the painful details of the artist's declining years, in which his gambling debts exploded and the resources he had remaining were stolen by greedy servants who secretly copied his pictures even before they were finished. Once, after he managed to stop gambling for 2 years, pay his debts, and save his money, Guido simply could not resist going back to the card table and immediately lost some 4,000 doubloons, as well as everything in his bank account. According to Malvasia, Guido pulled himself together at this point and finished up some masterpieces, including The Purification of the Virgin, 1638-9, which of course is now in the Louvre, and The Archangel Michael, 1635, commissioned by Antonio Barberini. The respite was short, however, and Guido soon was reduced to threatening to offer all of his work, finished and unfinished, at public auction outside his house. In one of the fictive orations Malvasia puts in Reni's mouth, the artist praises God for liberating him from the money he had accumulated. It only made him idle and suspicious of friends. gambling, after all, was an honourable and proper entertainment, not a crime. And he did not do it for the money, of which he had little need, especially, he said, as he could produce new fortunes with his own hands. Malvasia has Guido reject the idea that he should put together an immense pile of savings, as Peter Paul Rubens had done, for he had neither wife nor children. Now, this deliberate association of Reni with Rubens by Malvasia is important, for in many ways the life of the Flemish artist provides the most revealing comparison with Guido's, and it already did so in Malvasia's time. They were almost exactly the same age, Rubens being born just 2 years after Guido in 1577, and according to Malvasia, Reni held him in the highest regard. Guido would have been acquainted with Rubens's early work in Italy, such as his wonderful altarpiece in Santa Maria in Vallicella, with its wonderful silken surfaces that actually evoke even the style of later Guido. And Rubens himself must have been impressed by the naturalism of Guido's early work in Rome. Both had studied with late Mannerist painters before reforming their style, and both admired the work of Caravaggio. This, of course, is Rubens's copy of the Caravaggio deposition, which at the time he saw it was in the same church as his own altarpiece that you just saw. Though Guido did not share Rubens' voracious appetite for antiquity, just a drawing of the Laocoon to stand for enormous study by Rubens of ancient remains of Rome. And a very few perfect models, such as the beseeching head of a Niobid, reinterpreted as nature, served Guido very well. These two drawings showing one of the most favourite female heads in Guido's repertoire. Both artists were sought out by great monarchs, but whereas Rubens accepted invitations to France and Spain, Guido refused them. Both were so successful that they needed to set up large studios and delegate work. Rubens kept his under tighter control, but questions about the master's involvement in decorative projects, such as the tapestry cartoons, which I show an example of from the Prado on the screen, or the replication of favourite images, such as Guido Reni's Europa, of which he made several versions, are raised in both cases. Both artists made large sums of money, but as Malvasia well knew, Rubens hung on to his, acquiring not only fame but a fortune, not to mention a knighthood and a country estate, as you see on the screen. Guido's gold trains, given in honour of his art, were his last financial resource. Rubens lived consistently, like a gentleman. His comfortable house in Antwerp, which you see in two printed versions here, was filled with possessions, and it was set in a garden, which survives today. Whereas Guido preferred to keep his rooms in Centre City empty and spare, living almost as a Capuchin, in whose habit he would be buried. He preferred to hang out with the people he knew on the streets of Bologna, when not consorting with popes and princes. And here you get some sense. Here, of course, is San Petronio, Piazza Maggiore, and just in here is the site of Guido's studio, and his house is probably down here. But he lived, painted, socialized, practiced, and even gambled in the very dense centre of Bologna. Rubens celebrated family and fertility, where Reni kept only his mother's company and was said to be a virgin when he died. Their versions of the fall of man, both of them, of course, indebted to Titian, the one cool and considered, the other warm and passionate, speak eloquently to this difference between the two men. The courtly Rubens was cultivated and widely read, imagining even his own life in mythological terms, this marvellous painting in the Prado, whereas Reni apparently felt awkward about his lack of extensive learning. Guido despised ostentation, writes Malvasia, rarely using the carriage that he had obtained for his mother, and which he sold immediately when he caught his students using it. When one of them snapped that Rubens kept a carriage with 6 horses, Guido responded that such a great man ought to be imitated with regard to his art, not to his pomp, though as we should remember, Rubens himself embraced a kind of courtliness. If only, writes Malvasia, Guido had not been so straightforward in the Lombard way and had learned to dissimulate, and if he had not dissipated himself at cards, he could have had Raphael's fortunes and Titian's honours, and Italy could have had its own Rubens in terms of riches. In the new marketplace for art in 17th century Europe, when prices and prizes, rewards and reputation, traditions and talents were so wildly free-floating, Peter Paul Rubens and Guido Reni were playing for the highest stakes. Rubens, I think, succeeded in this. Reni, in the end, did not. His failure, which the comparison with Rubens elucidates, and which, if we look at such great masterpieces as this altarpiece in the Trinità dei Pellegrini, should remind us, is not truly an artistic failure, but that he did fail is in itself interesting. No other member of the Carracci school, not even Annibale himself, worked at Rubens's European level, just Guido. Even if Malvasia sometimes put words into Guido's mouth, he understood the tragedy of the situation. If no contemporary Italian painter could rival the success of Rubens, where Spanish royal and noble collections were concerned, there was a strong interest at court, especially among Spanish viceroys in Naples, in collecting modern Italian works and not just those old masters mentioned by Vasari. Among these, Guido Reni was the most prominently represented. In his La pittura italiana al Prado, which I mentioned last week, Juan Antonio Gaia singled out Reni's great Saint Sebastian for its powerful sense of the pathetic and the representation of real pain, its drawing and colour, identifying it as the most reproduced work in the Prado and popular with the general public. And I'm grateful to Enrico Quintana for taking time to look at these paintings with us yesterday and discussing the fact that much of this was a later edition and not by Guido. Gaia Nuno also approved of the Madonna of the Chair, while at the same time complaining of a languid loss of energy in the St. James and the Magdalene. Such was Guido's reputation in the Prado in 1961. We've learned a good deal since then, but I think much work remains to be done. And tonight I want to look first at the Madonna of the Chair, which could more accurately be called the Coronation of the Virgin with the Child. This large painting is among the very few works made by Guido Reni specifically for the Spanish court, and the only one, as far as I know, still in the Prado. Just 50 years ago, Alfonso Pérez Sánchez still thought this, at best, a secondary work by Guido, with much studio intervention, though he recognized that it had entered the royal collections quite early, being sent to the Escorial by Philip IV. Only when the painting was carefully cleaned in preparation for the Reni exhibitions of 1988 was it determined, in Giovanna degli Esposti's words, to be autograph and of high quality. Dating the work to around 1624-5, she remarked, as others had done before, that for this monumental composition, Guido had reworked Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna. The determination that this is an important original should come as no surprise, for in 1772, the writer and painter Antonio Pons stated in his Viaje de España that this was one of the most precious paintings in the Escorial and one of the most exquisite by the artist. That Guido's Madonna was already held in high regard in the 17th century is clear from Francisco de los Santos' unusually long description of the work. His mentions of works tend to be very, very abbreviated, but there's a long description of this in the 1667 edition, then in the Capitolo Prioral of the Escorial, whose collection Bonaventura Basegoda has recently reinterpreted in an exemplary way. An informed observer, the Hieronymite understood the composition in royal terms, not only because the queen is being crowned by angels, but also because of her throne, the colours of her robes, and the pavilion above her head. He also understood the paradoxical humility of her downward gaze and her submission to the naked child, whose pose he found especially tender. Guido's painting became a gallery painting in the Escorial, even as it is today in the Prado. But how did it start out and when? Here, I think Malvasia has an important contribution to make. In his discussion of the wide range of social classes seeking to own works by Guido Reni, Malvasia writes, and I quote, "There was no prince in those days, even beyond the Alps," and of course he means France, "who did not seek to embellish his museum or adorn his most secret cabinets with Guido's pictures, as did the Queen of Spain, who decorated her royal apartments with a Madonna given to the king, which she requested from him and obtained immediately. Similarly, the Queen of France graced her own apartment with the most beautiful Annunciation by Guido." Malvasia's comment has never been connected definitively with the Madonna and Child enthroned. It cannot, certainly, refer to another truly beautiful, much smaller Madonna and Child by Reni, now in the North Carolina Museum of Art, which was also listed by Santos in 1667, for that, as he described it, showed the child at the Virgin's breast. Recently, or relatively recently, José Luis Colomer suggested that the work in question was likely the Prado Assumption and Coronation of the Virgin, formally, that is in 1686, in the Alcazar. He found the Madonna and Child enthroned a less likely candidate, even while recognizing that it represented a meditation on the Virgin as Queen and Mother. Now, given the prominence of Guido's royal commissions throughout Europe, I think it unlikely that the king would have received, or that Malvasia would have given such importance to, a small devotional painting from Guido's early career, and of which there was, moreover, a second version actually I should say this would be the second version of a more famous version, then in a famous collection in Bologna belonging to the Sampieri. This is a very interesting painting that recently came to light and was bought with great intelligence by the Städel Museum in Frankfurt, which is, it would seem, the prime version, and of which, in fact, yet another version exists now in the National Gallery in London. So these are all small devotional paintings, one relating to the other, but none of them, I think, of the importance indicated by Malvasia's description. Furthermore, Malvasia quite specifically associates the Madonna given by the King of Spain to his wife with the beautiful Annunciation sent to adorn the apartments of Marie de' Medici in France. This was an even larger work, which arrived in Paris by 1629, and which probably inspired the invitation to Guido to come to Paris. It became one of Reni's most well-known works after the Queen donated it to the Carmelite Church on the Rue Saint-Jacques, where Bernini, when he visited Paris, said that it was one of the most beautiful things ever to be seen and worth half of Paris. Queen Isabella, who received the Prado Madonna, was Marie de' Medici's daughter. Married to the future Philip IV at the age of 13, and her brother Louis would marry the Spanish Infanta Anne, and this, of course, is the exchange made famous in the scene in Rubens's Medici cycle, where the two princesses are being exchanged between Spain and France. This marriage was consummated in 1620. The year after Philip ascended the throne, she produced their first child, who survived but a day. After the deaths of 4 girls, a son, Balthasar, known to you all, was born in October 1629. And this was the event celebrated so fervently, as I mentioned last week, in the Collegio di Spagna in Bologna. We cannot date the Madonna and Child enthroned precisely, though it seems to fit, as Degli Esposti suggested, in the early to mid-1620s, and certainly before the more ethereal Annunciation painted for Queen Isabella's mother. In this decade, we can say at least that the King and Queen of Spain needed a son. If this is indeed not only the picture given to the King of Spain and then to his Queen, but, like the Immaculate Conception, commissioned for the royal household from the outset, then its monumental appearance takes on a new meaning. The most frequently observed feature of Guido's composition is the reference to Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, a sculpture hardly known in Italy, because it was shipped to Bruges almost as soon as it was made. Raphael, however, immediately grasped its power, especially the child standing between the Virgin's knees, his contrapposto turn, and the presence of the book, as we see, for example, in the Madonna of the Goldfinch and in the Belle Jardinière. Guido revered the work of Raphael, and from the Madonna of the Goldfinch, he adopts the Virgin's tender touch with her right hand. The Alba Madonna provided the idea of her fingers gently keeping a place in the book. But Raphael never attempted the full frontal stance with the Virgin's lap seen head on and with only one child. For that, Reni could turn to another artistic hero, Parmigianino, who certainly had Michelangelo's invention in mind as he constructed his vision of St. Jerome. The iconography of the Bruges Madonna has been identified as Christ about to take his first step on the road to the Passion as his knowing mother looks on. Parmigianino's child practically leaps into space here, flinging his leg out as he riffles through the book, resting on his mother's thigh. His left elbow rests on the other thigh, and his hand touches his head gently, in a gesture that Reni would render more solid and in an image that was altogether more sober and majestic. Guido's inquiry into Raphael's inventions, themselves remarkable variations on Michelangelo's original, was already evident in the Madonna and Child enthroned with Saints Crispin, Crispinian, and Jerome, dating to 1620-21, and now in Dresden. And I apologize for the quality of this slide, but I think it suggests a moment in Guido's career that's not far from the Madonna and Child we're talking about. Guido adapted the figures of the Virgin and Child from the Belle Jardinière, placing the Virgin on a high velvet covered throne, as in the Madrid painting. But again, the composition lacked the crucial frontality of the Bruges Madonna. For that, Guido surely also had in his mind Annibale Carracci's early Madonna enthroned with St. John and St. Catherine for San Giorgio in Poggiale, Bologna. From Annibale, he also took up the rich colours of the Virgin's red robe, the colours of Christ's Passion and of the Church, very different from Parmigianino's washed-out hues. The following year, Ludovico Carracci adopted the Bruges Madonna format for his Madonna of St. Hyacinth, which is in itself also a variation on Parmigianino's lively image, but with the figure turned once again to the side. The Bruges Madonna, then housed, of course, in the Spanish Netherlands, and its progeny, seems to have provided an especially inspiring model for emulation and imitation among the Carracci. Guido's evocation of it is noteworthy precisely because it is so literal. If we add to this the form of the chair with ornaments and tassels, worthy of Raphael's portrait of Julius II, and the richness of the draperies suggestive of Raphael's unfinished Madonna del Baldacchino, it becomes difficult for this art historian anyway not to see this as a work that deliberately combines the model of Raphael with that of Michelangelo and now united in an Emilian style. Even the morning gesture of the infant Christ, hand on head, recalls Michelangelo, this time the piti tondo, but rendered by Guido more pensive than tragic, and in the figure of a vivacious Carracesque Puto. I am, of course, leading us to a conclusion that this unique work, and such it is, was designed and produced for a French queen, whose Florentine Medici lineage it was important to emphasize in her new home in Spain. The message was both stylistic and iconographic. Seated on the throne of wisdom, Mary is crowned by little angels as Queen of Heaven. This was a familiar enough subject, but one, of course, that had become particularly important in Spain in the vigorous debates over the Immaculate Conception. The campaign to have the doctrine pronounced by the Pope as dogma was led in Spain by the Franciscans and supported by the Crown. In a letter of November the 21st, 1621, that was carried to the Bolognese Pope, Gregory XV, by the Count of Monterey, Philip IV wrote of the Spanish monarchy's veneration of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, begging him to extend it through Christianity. Queen Isabella, soon to be the owner of our painting, sent her own letter. While resisting Spanish pressure for full recognition of dogma, successive popes consistently recognized the Virgin as a heavenly queen, conceived without sin. Urban VIII referred to her as the Empress of Heaven, to be shown with a crown. In Spain, every possible visual argument was made to insist upon the Virgin's role and upon her link to the royal house. Guido's own Immaculate Conception, now in New York, was, according to Malvasia, commissioned by the Spanish ambassador to Rome for the Infanta. Queen Isabel herself, appearing with her son, Balthazar, would be presented as the Church and as grace, and associated with the Immaculate Virgin in Calderon's sacramental play, El Nuevo Palacio del Retiro, performed in celebration of the new palace, not far from here, in 1634. Reni often repeated his compositions, but the Madonna and Child enthroned is unique in his oeuvre. This is, I think, to be explained by the fact that this painter of divine grace of the Virgin produced the Madonna and Child enthroned for the king to give to Queen Isabel in the early years of their reign for her private quarters, when her status as queen and as mother was most urgently to be established and indeed prayed for. So, to change to an entirely different kind of work by Guido, the second great work I want to look at tonight with some detail, the Atalanta and Hippomenes, was definitely not commissioned by the Spanish court. As in the case of the Madonna and Child, however, it was the opportunity provided by an exhibition that allowed it to be properly judged. The Prado Exhibition of 1970 allowed most critics to follow Pérez Sánchez in determining that the Prado version was superior to the better known and perhaps even better preserved, even perhaps partly autographed version of the same composition in the Museo di Capodimonte in Naples. A successful cleaning solidified that opinion, though the full beauty of this work perhaps remains to be seen. Until recently, all we could be sure of was that the painting was in the royal collection in 1666, where it was viewed by Cosimo de' Medici on his visit to the Alcazar in 1668-9, who said dismissively that it was not worth all the fame it had achieved. This response, of course, is just what Malvasia expected from a Florentine. Thanks to the research of Antonio Vanulli and others, we can now be certain that the painting was purchased on behalf of the King of Spain by the Spanish Viceroy of Naples, Gaspar de Bracamonte y Guzman, Count of Peñaranda. The Atalanta and Hippomenes was one of a remarkable group of 18 paintings he bought in 1664 from the estate of Marchese Giovanni Francesco Serra di Cassano, that included several of the Prado's great treasures of Italian painting, notably including Annibale's Venus and Adonis that we saw last week. Giovanni Francesco Serra, a heroic general who was born in Genoa in 1609, lived and died in the service of Spain, having been taken there as an orphan in 1616. This portrait by Francesco del Carro was made before his return to Spain from Milan in 1652. On Serra's final journey home to Italy in the company of Don John of Austria, his galley was attacked by pirates. He was desperate to get back home, but was never to make it. Fatally wounded, he was buried at sea, weighed down by a cannonball. The 1664 sale probably took place in Naples, where the descendants resided. On August 30th, 1664, they would receive 14,000 ducats from Peñaranda for the paintings sold to the king. Like Annibale's Venus and Adonis, the Atalanta has no prior history. As we shall see, they might even be connected in other ways. Malvasia's only mention of this painting is in his remarkable catalogue of prints produced by Bolognese printmakers or after Bolognese paintings. And this, by a little-known printmaker, Giovanni Battista Pesca, is in fact listed by Malvasia, but he clearly never saw the painting. Neither Scarnelli nor Malvasia seem to have seen either the Atalanta nor Annibalé's Venus and Adonis, though Scarnelli mentions the Serra collection. The only recorded visitor arrived late on the scene. In 1665, Padre Resta, the Oratorian scholar and collector of drawings, noted in his copy of Giovanni Baglione's Vitae that in Milan he'd seen paintings in the gallery of the Marchese Serra, including a Venus and Adonis by Titian and another by Annibale Carracci, as he put it, done in the good style of Correggio, as well as others that had been sold to the Viceroy Peñaranda in the preceding year. It's frustrating to find no mention of the Guido at all. On the surface of it, the story of Atalanta and Hippomenes, like that of Venus and Adonis, is a very simple one, told by Ovid in Book 10 of the Metamorphoses. A beautiful young maiden, fleet of foot, is told by an oracle that she should never marry, but that she will, and though staying alive, she will lose herself. She therefore lives terrified in the woods, warning suitors that she can only be won by whomever outruns her in a race, but those who lose to her must die. Many tried and failed. Hippomenes falls in love with her on first sight and challenges her. She falls for him, moved by his youth, wishing he would flee rather than race. Hippomenes begs Venus to help him, and in return she gives him her 3 golden apples, teaching him how to use them. As the race takes off, Atalanta tries to delay as Hippomenes tires, at which point he throws down one of the apples. Atalanta stops to pick it up, but then again overtakes Hippomenes. Again he throws down an apple, and again she delays but catches up. Hippomenes throws down the last apple obliquely, and she has to slow down even more, as Venus compels her to pick it up, making the apple even heavier. Hippomenes wins the race, and Atalanta is his prize. Yet the ending of the story is necessarily unhappy. Hippomenes never thanked Venus, and out of spite, she caused the couple to make passionate love in a temple of Cybele, who turned them into the lions who draw her chariot as punishment for this act of desecration. Now, Guido's composition gives little space for onlookers, and in this it can be contrasted to earlier versions of the scene, such as Nicola Giolfino's charming panel or other 17th century depictions, such as Martin de Vos's image in his illustrated Ovid. This is the edition of 1607, but I think it first appears in 1602, or in Rubens's very jolly and athletic design for the Torre della Parada. Set on a dark seashore where dawn is breaking, just here, Guido includes only slightly ghostly groups of figures in the background, courtly, slim figures, who resemble somewhat the figures in Antonio Tempesta's design from 1606. Guido's focus is entirely on 2 nude figures that fill the large canvas. This composition might then seem to be a perfect demonstration of Reni's lack of ability to tell a story. As we shall see, telling the story was not Guido's goal. The great French scholar Marc Fumaroli has proposed a reading of Reni's picture linked to the medieval tradition of the moralized Ovid. Much hangs in his interpretation on the gesture made by Hippomenes with his right hand as that of physical rejection. And he compares this to similar gestures in images of Noli Me Tangere, but also let's look at Joseph rejecting Potiphar's wife and Susanna rejecting the elders. He sees in this the opening of a moral gap between the sensual Atalanta, diverted by avarice and voluptuousness, and the airy, pure Hippomenes, seen as a Christian soul rejecting temptation. This is a very provocative reading, but I don't think in the end it really fits the circumstances. The moralized Ovid was not especially popular in 17th century Bologna, where Atalanta would more likely have been appraised as a donna forte, or strong woman. And Hippomenes' gesture, and of course this gesture could be much debated, surely carries no more moral or religious meaning than the hand of Apollo in Bernini's closely contemporary. And the relationship here, I think, remains to be worked out chronologically, Apollo and Daphne, which is, of course, another Ovidian subject of tragic, amorous flight. It's a gesture that, as Bernini understood, also, if you will indulge me for a moment, belongs quite naturally to the graceful running athlete, who may have just thrown a ball, but I don't think so. He's running. The intensity of superimposition of movement and stasis in Guido's chiastic composition should lead us in a different direction. In fact, a fundamental chiasmus, which is the term for a rhetorical figure of crossing, lies at the very heart of Ovid's text. Earlier illustrators of Ovid, much less eloquent than Guido, but they also understood this, showing Atalanta looking back or down, Hippomenes moving forward but looking back, often. And the range of possibilities of back and forth here is nearly endless, it would seem. Yet Guido's utter concentration on the struggle between two runners who are to become lovers is unique, placing total emphasis on the notion of opposition, whether of draperies, horizons, and most of all, arms and legs. Atalanta's left leg is crossed by Hippomenes' right. His left moves forward as her right moves back, and so on, with many limbs mirroring each other. Hippomenes' drapery flutters as it should behind him as he moves forward, whereas hers moves back, emphasizing the speed with which she has pivoted, as well as the drapery's lightness. Hippomenes, Ovid tells us, had watched a race before challenging Atalanta, observing how running made her even more beautiful, and how her hair was tossed back over her white shoulders. In Guido's painting, as in no other example that I know of, she is once again following Ovid, naked. Hippomenes' gesture does not, I think, does imply a rejection, but not the soul's rejection of the flesh. If he is to win this race, Atalanta must lose. For him to possess her, she must stay away from him, behind him, or he will die. There can, however, be no winner. We know this from Ovid's story, which is a story within a story within a story. All the fables in Book 10 are sung by Orpheus, but in this case the story is told through the voice of Venus, who tells her beloved Adonis about the origin of her hatred for wild beasts, who yield to neither youth nor beauty. The oracle had said to Atalanta that she must flee from marriage, yet the oracle also predicts that she will not flee, and though remaining alive, will lose herself. As the story develops, so do its oppositional structures. Hippomenes pleads with Atalanta to race. If he wins, it will be no shame, for he is a noble foe. If he loses, then she will be famous for defeating him. In any race, there is always a loser. Hippomenes does not know that in this race, nobody wins. Both must lose, given that Atalanta's marriage will be fatal. Guido's figure expresses that flight from fate as much as Hippomenes' will to win. At the sight of Hippomenes, Atalanta in turn is torn between her antithetical desires to conquer and be conquered. Now, Guido's opposition of a very boyish Hippomenes with a voluptuous Atalanta is also inspired by Ovid's opposition of this puer, this boy as he calls him, whose face is virginal, with the naked woman of whom Venus, in Ovid's story, says that she is as beautiful as herself, so she is a venereal figure. In the end, Hippomenes wins the race with Venus's help, the 3 golden apples setting up a zigzag of back and forth between the two. Guido selects the absolute point of balance, when each runner has 1 apple in hand, 1 concealed, I believe, and 1 revealed. And the second apple is causing Atalanta to stop and stoop as Hippomenes turns to see her slow down. Unlike the deathly backward glance into the underworld of Orpheus, who in fact in Ovid's account is telling this tale, this backward look, a mixture of terror at the prospect of death and hapless pleasure at the possibility of the satisfaction of his desire, at least promises victory. But as Venus recounts, Hippomenes' lack of gratitude leads to the fulfillment of the prophecy. These two runners, who are like those swiftly running gentle deer that Venus urges Adonis to hunt, are transformed through their ingratitude and uncontrolled passion into wild beasts who are moved neither by youth nor by beauty. They are like the wild boar by which Adonis, ignoring her warning, will be killed. In his Atalanta and Hippomenes, Guido was revisiting the chiastic structure of his religious masterpiece, The Massacre of the Innocents, painted a decade before. In The Massacre, the executioner's arms form a cross around which figures flee to the sides, open-mouthed, with the bloody dagger at the empty center as the crux or point of balance. Here Guido constructs the contrast of love and death, of hope and fear, and as the poet Giambattista Marino understood, the paradox of his ability in painting such horror to achieve such great beauty, to bring the infants alive with his brush, even as he also kills them with it. That paradox, in this case, is resolved by the presence of the little angels above, who hold the palms of martyrdom. This crux, this crossing, is resolved through the promise of Christ on the cross, for whom these innocents are proto-martyrs. Atalanta and Hippomenes suffer a different passion. Their crux is the happiest moment they will endure, seemingly the point of greatest uncertainty, but one leading to no good resolution. Guido and his contemporaries in Bologna would, I think, have been more familiar with a rhetorical Ovid than the moralized one suggested in Fumaroli's account. One commentary on the Metamorphoses by Raphael Regius, first published in Venice in 1493, was widely used in the 16th century for the teaching of eloquence. The inner dialogues in Ovid's text provided especially useful examples of reasoning or deliberation, and Hippomenes' words posed a notable deliberative struggle. Of his proposal to Atalanta that she can win either way, Remigius, in his commentary here, says on Hippomenes' words, "Siu vinca," meaning, if I am conquered. And Remigius says that of these words, if I am conquered, in a dilemma, Hippomenes considers that Atalanta should contend with him, even if he might die. And it's very, very important here to realize that Raphael Regius sees this deliberately as a dilemma, that Hippomenes is, in fact, having an inner deliberation about what would happen if he might die. Guido's attraction to chiastic construction and argument led him, I think, to interpret Ovid's story not as a lyrical romance or an account of lost love, but as the arrested moment that represents, in its very construction, the horns of a true dilemma, both logical and rhetorical. To look now, to compare just how this works in relation to the pictures that are so closely related to it, Annibale, obviously inspired by Titian's heartbreaking image of Adonis and Venus being separated by Adonis's fateful passion to hunt wild beasts, Annibale expresses the poetic lyricism of the moment of the lovers' first encounter in a verdant landscape, with just, of course, a hint of danger, of the dog becoming alert to the movement off stage, as it were. Guido follows instead Ovid's rhetorical construction of an impossible struggle between love and death, hope and fear, male and female, in a race that cannot be won. This remarkable work distills and questions the familiar compositional contrapposto that we know to be deployed by Annibale and Titian. It's tempting to see these two great Bolognese works, which were once in the same collection in Italy, on Ovidian themes as perhaps linked from the beginning, maybe even revealing Guido asserting himself once again, quite consciously, in a rivalry with Annibale. But that, of course, is speculation. Giorgio Vasari, remember Malvasia had very little good to say about him, often made up stories about artists in order to explain their work, sharing the view that the artist was reflected in his work. Many of these have been shown to be more appropriate for fiction than for history. Modern criticism has been forgiving of this, accommodating Vasari's literary efforts. Carlo Cesare Malvasia, as I suggested last week, approached biography quite differently. He filled the lives with documented facts, as well as with stories gathered up from friends, servants, and pupils, but he did not make things up. And even where he had a mountain of information, as in the case of Guido, he did not relate the habits of personal life to questions of style or manner. He certainly saw that the disorderliness of Guido's studio affected his control over its output. Most of all, his compulsive gambling robbed Guido of the riches of Rubens. But Guido Reni preferred risk above all, and he was prepared to lose everything, always believing, as compulsive gamblers do, that he could make it all back again. In Guido's fortune, love wittily attempts to hold on to fortune as she scatters money and jewels at random from a purse. Malvasia understood that Guido's defiant love of chance and its gains and losses brought pleasure, but this was mixed with much pain. We've come to think of Reni's early rival, Caravaggio, as the 17th century artist who lived most dangerously, because he murdered a man and because he painted the world of card players and gypsy fortune tellers. Guido Reni did not paint that underworld, preferring heavenly visions and female beauty. But his embrace of risk was as deeply pathological, I think, as Caravaggio's. His contrariness, as reported by Malvasia, reveals the paradoxical nature of a compulsive gambler always hovering on the edge of reason. Had Malvasia been a biographer in the manner of Vasari, and had he known this extraordinary work, he might very well have singled out the Atalanta and Hippomenes in the Prado as most representative of Guido Reni's grasp of the unresolvable dilemmas of logic and of existential fate, and not only of the grace and beauty that it also conveys. Thank you very much.